A freight train is easing through a curve in the middle of a city before sunrise, moving at exactly the speed limit posted for that stretch of track, nothing close to reckless in any way at all. 15 miles an hour, slower than most people jog on an ordinary morning, barely faster than a brisk walk down the block. And then, without any warning anyone on board could have caught in time to react, cars lift sideways off the rails and come to rest a few steps from apartment buildings nearby. No collision with anything else. No obvious mechanical failure anyone could point to at first glance either. Just a slow, ordinary train, somehow doing something a train moving that gently isn't really supposed to be able to do to itself at all. Let's get into it right here on Small Things. Not one machine, hundreds. Here's the part that changes the whole story. A freight train isn't one long, rigid object moving as a single solid piece down the track. It's hundreds of individual cars, each one connected to the next by a coupler that isn't actually locked tight. There's a few inches of built-in looseness at every single connection, on purpose, by design. Picture a chain lying loosely coiled on the ground, picked up link by link from one end. The far end doesn't move the instant the near end lifts off the ground. It has to catch up first, link by link, through all that built-in slack. A train works the same basic way, except the chain is a couple of miles long and each link happens to weigh more than 100 tons. A small failure, deep inside a long train. It did not begin with anything dramatic. In the early hours of one ordinary morning, a freight train nearly 2.5 miles long was rolling downhill toward a curve near downtown Austin, Texas, pulled and pushed by locomotives at both the front and somewhere buried deep in the middle of the consist. That mid-train locomotive existed specifically to share the workload with the engines up front, and on this particular morning, an electrical fault inside it quietly cut its power. In an instant, it stopped pulling anything at all and became dead weight, still rolling along with everything else, just no longer contributing any push of its own. The train kept descending the hill regardless. The head end, still under full power, held its own section back at the posted speed. But behind that dead locomotive stretched a long tail of loaded cars that hadn't gotten the memo, still carrying all the momentum they'd built up rolling downhill, with nothing in the middle helping to hold them back anymore. Every one of those cars kept doing exactly what a moving mass does when nothing stops it. It kept going, pressing forward into whatever was directly ahead of it. That pressure had nowhere else to go except into the couplers, one after another, car slamming gently into the car ahead of it, each impact adding just a little more to the next one down the line. The rear of the train was quietly bunching up against the front, the way traffic bunches on a highway when the cars ahead brake and the ones behind haven't caught up yet. Except here it was happening through solid steel connections instead of open road. By the time that compressed wave of motion finally reached the curve, it arrived at the exact same moment the cars themselves did, and the geometry of that curve is where the physics finally found somewhere to go. None of this required anything unusual to happen. A locomotive losing power to an electrical fault is a routine, well-understood event on a railroad, the kind of thing crews are trained to handle without much drama. A downhill curve through a city is ordinary track, the kind every railroad runs through somewhere. What made this particular morning different was simply how long the train actually was, and where exactly that one dead locomotive happened to sit inside it. Stretch, compress, and why curves betray it. So what actually happens inside all that built-in slack once it actually starts moving? Railroaders describe it as having two faces. When a train is being pulled forward and every coupler stretches out to its full length, that's called draft force. Tension, the whole train behaving like a rope being pulled taut from one end. When the opposite happens, when the rear of the train catches up to the front and those same couplers slam shut instead of stretching out, that's buffing force, compression, the train behaving less like a rope and more like a line of dominoes shoved together from behind. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely dangerous even at low speed. Those forces don't actually depend all that much on how fast the train happens to be going at the time. What matters far more is mass, and how much of it is moving relative to the car sitting right next to it. A 100-ton car closing just a few inches of slack, even at not much more than a walking pace, delivers a shove measured in tens of thousands of pounds of force. Multiply that across a couple hundred cars, all compressing together in sequence, one after another down the line, and the force stacking up at the pinch point can reach levels steel was never really asked to handle sideways in the first place. On a straight, flat section of track, a train can usually absorb that kind of shove and simply shudder through it. A curve is a different story entirely. Compression pushing through a curve doesn't want to follow the bend in the track. It wants to straighten the whole train out, and the only way to do that is to shove the cars sideways, outward, toward the high side of the curve, which is exactly where the Austin cars ended up. Push hard enough that way, and a car can climb right off the rail instead of following it around the bend. It was never about speed. It's tempting to hear that a train derailed and assume someone up front must have handled it wrong, braking too hard or too late, or simply not reacting fast enough once something started going sideways. The engineer at the controls that morning did nothing unusual at all. He held the train at the posted speed the entire time, exactly as trained, with no warning light, alarm, and no indication on any gauge in the cab that anything behind him had changed. The failure happened out of his sight and out of his control, a mile or more back down the consist, in a locomotive he couldn't see and had no way to inspect from where he sat. Nothing about this incident traces back to a person making the wrong call in the moment. It's also easy to look at an incident like this and conclude that long trains must simply be dangerous, full stop, and that shorter trains would obviously be the safer choice by comparison. That's a considerably bigger claim than this one specific case actually supports. What happened near Austin demonstrates one particular mechanism at work, a mid-train power loss triggering a compression wave that happened to find a curve at exactly the wrong moment. It doesn't prove that train length by itself causes derailments as some kind of general rule. Plenty of very long trains cross curves just like that one every single day without anything going wrong, simply because the forces involved usually stay well within whatever the equipment was built to handle. Power from the middle of the train. An engineer at the front of a mile-long train climbing a steep mountain grade on a cold morning sends a radio command back to a locomotive buried somewhere deep in the middle of the consist, asking it to add power at the exact same moment the lead units do, keeping the whole train pulling together as one coordinated unit instead of straining unevenly at one end. A mid-train locomotive on a completely different train, hundreds of miles away and on an entirely different route through different terrain, charges the brake line from its own position partway down the consist, letting braking pressure reach the rear cars far faster than if it only had to travel all the way back from the very front of the train. A dispatcher watching sensor data carefully from an office nowhere near the actual tracks confirms that power is being shared evenly between the front and middle of a long train working its way slowly through hilly terrain that morning, exactly as the whole distributed system was originally designed to do from the very start of the program. A freight crew crossing flat, open country on an unremarkable afternoon never gives the mid-train locomotive a second thought the entire trip, because on that particular day, Like on the overwhelming majority of ordinary days that quietly came before it, the system simply does its job quietly in the background without anyone on board ever needing to notice it at all. A little movement repeated. A freight train was never really one solid machine gliding down the rails as a single connected piece. It's hundreds of heavy cars, each one connected to the next by a coupler with just a few inches of give built into it, constantly stretching and compressing as the train moves through hills and curves. A few inches of slack on any one car looks like nothing at all on its own. Repeat that same small movement across hundreds of cars, all shifting in the same direction at nearly the same moment, and it stops being nothing whatsoever. It becomes a force capable of lifting loaded steel off the rails, even when the train itself is barely moving. On a train that long, danger was never guaranteed to come from speed. Sometimes it comes instead from how thousands of tons quietly move against each other. If this changed the way you look at a freight train rolling through your town next time you see one, let us know in the comments below what you want us to explore next in a future video. We might make it our next episode. Thanks for watching. History often hides in the smallest details.